Is it like -8 or something?
Yeah, I mean, at night it's been getting down to like -26.
Oh my God. That sounds dreadful. Do all your
Most,
pipes like freeze and explode? How do you even survive?
yeah, I was just seeing a news story yesterday that a lot of businesses in town were having that trouble. So there's, different handymen going around just one place after the next. Luckily, that I haven't had any issues myself.
Oh, I am glad. Yeah, we had pipes burst last year just in time for Christmas. So home, but luckily no issue at this point. But we went sleighing earlier, so that was fun. It actually, when I was a kid, it snowed in Virginia all the time, but it doesn't snow that much now. So the kids were quite excited, and the snowball fighting was quite a joy. So we enjoyed that. I did enjoy how Haven made the biggest snowball imaginable and plowed me with it when I was looking
Uh,
away for a second. So he got me pretty good. So I was pleased with that one.
that's classic.
Yeah, it is fun. But Tyler, what you been thinking about, my friend? What's been going through your mind?
Oh, I don't know. I've kind of well, I was just listening to you and Dave McCarricker over at Theory Underground,
Oh, I love Dave.
and yeah, looking forward to hearing you guys talk some more. You know, I think I might have mentioned um, I have now been actually talking with an analyst for maybe 2 or 3 months, and it the the benefits of that and kind of it's so crazy how like it really is the analyst says like nothing. And I don't know, there's something really beautiful about it. I've
Mm.
been going back and reading Bruce Fink's book Lacan on Love, and just some of the stuff in that I feel like by virtue of going through this experience of with this with this analyst, I feel like some of these books are opening themselves up to me in ways that I don't know that they could have um, without experiencing this radical, like non-judgmental, non-prescriptive, just theirness of the other.
Mm.
um, yeah, I don't know. There's something in Bruce Fink's book Lacan on Love. He talks about, I think Fink starts by quoting Lacan saying that, you know, the analyst is kind of like Socrates in that they don't know anything, but maybe there is actually one thing that we know something about, and that's love. And then he goes on to kind of talk about how I think it's in the symposium, OCB. I'm gonna mix up or not say the names correctly, but Alcibiades talks about how Socrates loves them, loves you, and then before you know it, you're in love with
Mm.
Socrates himself. But it's through I I get the impression that it's actually just through listening and not I don't know. Just I feel like my experience in analysis has been one where I'm maybe learning how to love through a new way of listening to people.
Mm.
Um, but but that's that would I'd have to go back and look at some of my notes to be a little more precise on what I mean by a new way of listening. Maybe it's something to do with like on one hand not getting so caught up in the content and trying to follow exactly what the person is saying, but listening more for certain signifiers that stand out. Just little funny parts of the speech that kind of stand out and go and just jumping in with a question of he said somebody's talking about a guy maybe oh, that guy, he was such a grease boat. And you, as the analyst, maybe would just say grease boat. And that's all. There's nothing more than that, but it just calls attention back to this odd, probably mixing together of dreamboat and grease monkey or something like that. And that's an example that Derek Hook uses. I've been finding his work, his YouTube channel, really really cool to go back and watch some of his talks in conjunction with being an analysand myself. So anyways, that's some of the stuff that's been on my mind.
Well, I think that's wonderful. Mr. Luber, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. And it's very interesting. I've been thinking about, one, how philosophy is the love of wisdom. And it's almost like life is a lot about not getting too far on the side of wisdom or too far on the side of love. And it's like you need the love of wisdom. And by love, it's almost like we're talking about the psychoanalysis of wisdom. It's almost like that is what philosophy is. And I don't think it's by chance that Lacan and psychoanalysis just fit so well with philosophy, because I think basically if you say philosophy is the love of wisdom, then it's like, well, what is love? We hardly even know what wisdom is. And it's funny how we kind of skip the love of wisdom straight to the wisdom part. But there is a question of like, what is love? How do you love? And perhaps one of the reasons why we've ended up with problematic forms of philosophy is because there's been a skipping of the love to the wisdom and going straight to the wisdom without working on the subject. But then it's interesting because the other thing I've been thinking about is, why is it there's this kind of like, there's always this concern people have that philosophy keeps you from relationship, or that it keeps you from emotion, or that it keeps you. When actually, in my experience, a lot of people, especially in these corners, ended up in philosophy, not because they necessarily wanted to. They basically found no way to avoid it because they had drama, or people misunderstood one another, or there were problems they couldn't. And it's really interesting because often, it depends on who you ask. A lot of people get in philosophy because they don't know how not to. Because so for example, when you're talking about the analyst sitting there silently, not saying anything, why would you ever think that that's a good methodology? What makes you go, hey, this is actually quite powerful? How would you even learn the art of saying certain words like grease boat versus others, right? It's not obvious that silence can have this powerful psychoanalytical impact, right? So it seems like you have to think to arrive at it. But then there's also this tension of, well, thinking is getting in the way of relationship, right? But it's like relationship without thinking seems so problematic. That's one of the reasons why people end up in psychoanalysis or philosophy, is because they end up in drama. Again, a lot of people end up in psychoanalysis not because they said, I want to do psychoanalysis. It's almost like they didn't see how not to. They didn't see, and it's almost like, because you have to somehow hold together love and wisdom, there's always this, don't go too far on the wisdom side, but then you're coming, don't go too far on the love side, don't go too far on the wisdom side. And it's interesting how maybe that constant concern of philosophy getting in the way of relationships, in the same way that people are concerned that relationships get in the way of thinking, because you're emotional, you're not really thinking. Maybe that's just part of the craft, the part of the tool shop, part of the necessary tension, because otherwise we end up too much on love or too much on wisdom, and you've got to have both. Because the other thing too is, honestly, it's interesting how people get concerned about philosophy getting in the way of relationship, but not so much, say, soccer or football or other hobbies that people have. There's something unique about people's concern with philosophy that you don't see that if a bunch of guys hang out to talk about the football game, that doesn't bother people. But there's something about philosophy that does bother people, which maybe, I don't know, maybe it's because if you do philosophy, it forces you to change how you think about relationships. And people don't want to have to change how they think about relationships in a manner that would psychoanalytically convict them. So let's accuse philosophy and psychoanalysis of not caring about emotions and relationships, actually, to make it seem like it's that for the right reasons we're concerned about it. So those are things that come to mind. I'll pass it to Mr. Luber and Michelle. Good to see you. Because it's always interesting. It's like the psychoanalysis of wisdom. And why is it we have this concern of philosophy getting in the way of relationships when it's not, when people aren't so quick to do that with, say, sports or football or talking about the weather, or even just sitting at a table not saying anything at all? It's like, oh, well, sitting across from one another at a table and not speaking is intimate because silence is intimate. But don't talk about Plato because that's a threat to relationships. It's very interesting. It's a very widespread thing that you see. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, it's good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too, Tyler. Good to see you, Michelle, as always. I think this is I've actually been thinking about this a lot because I went out Saturday night. My friend was DJing, and there's times when I'm out where I just get very quiet and I feel very, thank you, Michelle. I get very quiet. And then what happens is I ask myself, why am I so quiet? Why do I feel like I don't care to speak? And I internalize that as loneliness. It's like, oh, I'm feeling lonely. But what you guys are saying is just making me feel that I forget where Lacan like says this, but it's like when you look at I'm like paraphrasing. It's like when you look at a beautiful landscape, there's really not much to say. It's like it just is. It's just you're immersed in the beauty, you in the landscape itself, the sunset, whatever it may be. And I think what happens, it's so hard for philosophers on either side, love or the wisdom, to really socialize about that because they're embedded in it. They're like one with it. So to speak of it is almost to dislodge yourself from within it. It's almost like it reminds me of like Chitan when he's talking about violence and just there's a certain, I feel like where I was Saturday night, for me to talk, it would have been so forced. Like and the forcing of me talking would have maybe subconsciously or just unaware, unbeknownst to myself, if I force myself to talk, then I'm like almost trying to be in a position in which I'm not currently stationed in. And I think it's a lot easier to talk in the position of like when you're in a sports setting and you're embedded in that beauty. It's much easier to talk because people that are also in this sports situation need to talk in order to like participate in the sport. Where like when you're out and it's like a DJ or it's very much music as the medium, it's very hard to communicate unless it's like dance, unless it's something that is embedded in the actual situation. So I think there's something with the philosopher, almost like when they're talking and they're talking about wisdom or beauty, wisdom or love, they're coming from a place where they were initially situated to these concepts in a way where they were embedded in these concepts. And then, but the moment in which they talk about these concepts, there's like a split. There's a act of violence almost where I'm like violently going away from my embeddedness. So because that might be what's happening, it's interpreted as antisocial because it's like, look, I'm talking so you can be embedded in it with me. And there's like an assumption on that part. So it's like the philosopher is assuming that they're not embedded based off of their position and watching the other people behave in whatever situation. And because the philosopher talks in such a way where they're coming from a place where they were embedded, it just comes off very offensive or just rubs people the wrong way because it's assuming that they're not embedded, and it's traumatizing. It's like almost like you're trying to fuck with me. Like, why are you fucking with me? Just let me be. But the problem is, from the philosopher's position, they're interpreting the situation as if they're not actually embedded in the situation. How can I let you be? You're not actually operating in a way that's virtuous, good for you in the context in which you're situated in. So that's what I think the dilemma is. There's like, just to summarize, I think there's like a two-part dilemma. There's the internal dilemma within the philosopher where they have to do an act of violence within their own position toward love or wisdom in order to even talk about their love and wisdom. And then from the perspective of the person taking in what the philosopher's saying, they aren't coming from a position where they're thinking about or being self-aware about how they're embedded with love and wisdom. So because they're not thinking about that, it always seems like an offense, an attack, because they're thinking about it maybe from a different position, or maybe not as intimately embedded, so to speak. I hope that made sense. I think this is a great conversation ultimately for myself. Like, when I feel as if I'm lonely, it might just be a conflation of me just accepting something beautiful. Like, the acceptance of something beautiful might seem lonely because it's hard to like be like, hey, come experience this position with me, and just like grab someone and like have them existentially be in the same exact position. So because it's very hard, if not impossible, to do that just by like mere grabbing and pulling someone over to sit next to you, so to speak, at like a club, it's not going to work like that. So it can feel very lonely, but really it's just, you're so like, it's like you're so appreciative of what's happening that you're just going to have to experience it by yourself. And that's not actually lonely. That's just you being so one with so many others that it's like, oh my God, you being one with so many others actually can feel lonely because you feel like you're going on that journey by yourself and you can't really talk about it. So yeah, I hope that made sense. It's really
I think that was excellent put. And Mr. Ebert, good to see you, sir. I hope you're not freezing to death, because up here in Virginia, it's gone to like 7 degrees. So best to you, sir. And Michelle, good. And I'll let Michelle speak. It was very interesting as you were speaking, because it made me think of like, like you have something like Dreisen sitting on Oppenheimer's bed, and you have all these scientists that are like blood brothers who really care about each other. And yet, if I listen to what they talk about, since I can't really access it the same way they do, then it can, it's almost like that in of itself creates a feeling of, well, how could this create a relationship? But it's actually you're not understanding that membrane. That's kind of a term people use, like the idea of a membrane, because you're not able to do science at their level or kind of communicate it to you. The experience of hearing them speak about science is actually like a wall. But to them, it's like a love language, a language of embedding. And so and likewise, when you hear people like who are experts at maybe like water purification at some company, well, that's their love language. And to them, that's really exciting and they're really embedded. But if you're not part of that business or that company, there's a kind of like feeling of, I can't access it. And then it's like, well, how could this possibly create a relationship? But the only way to get it would be to be in it. And maybe the reason why philosophy is uniquely prone to being accused of not helping relationship is because whereas if you're all connected in the membrane of a certain business, it's legitimated by the work, like the fact that you have a work, or if you're in the membrane of football where there's a social script of watching sports, so there's like, oh, they're into it, I don't really get it, but hey, it's supported by the social order, it's okay. Funny enough, philosophy doesn't really have a place, precisely because it can be about everything. And so it's harder to have a kind of social script to understand that feeling of membranic exclusion as being justified. because it seems like there's no reason to talk this way because it's not part of your work. It's not part of the football or sports. And so that inherent membranic push out, exclusion, of which comes with any language game, is particularly pronounced with philosophy, precisely because philosophy can be about anything. Therefore, there's nothing that gives it a kind of social support to justify it. And I think that's also quite good on what you're saying on the membrane, and I'll give it to Michelle and then Tyler and Mr. Jockin, good to see you. And then Mr. Cheaton, good to see you, sir. I appreciate everyone's pivoting with the weather and the schedule and different things. And it's almost like too, like if you're like, I don't know, like Kurt Gödel, and you're the only person who can think the thoughts that you can think, there's an inherent loneliness that comes with it that's precisely from a kind of expertise that comes from a certain work that creates a feeling of loneliness, but that loneliness is actually a testament to the expertise, right? And so that, and then it's actually like if your experience, like you were saying with music, you've met the condition of being able to experience a certain kind of quality of experience or music or a nutritious experience that you can't just share with the people around you because they too would have to meet the condition. So there's a feeling of loneliness, but that loneliness is actually a testament to the undergoing of conditions to have that kind of experience. So it's very interesting to think that there's kind of that kind of irony that's sort of playing. The more that you're able to experience certain depths of experience, the more there's a loneliness that's precisely a testament to the depth that you could then interpret as evidence that you've gone the wrong way. That's what's key. Like if you're saying, oh, I'm lonely, that must mean I've done something wrong. Well, actually, maybe that's just part of what it means to develop the ability to have that kind of apprehension. So I'm really interested in what you were saying. And then Cheaton, no worries. It's good to see you, sir. And I will give it to Michelle and then Tyler. Michelle, please.
Hey guys, great to see you all, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm using the headphones. Okay. Yeah, I think this is a great topic, and I really appreciate what you've been sharing, Daniel, and Andrew, what you just shared. And I mean, I think that if anyone like for the these are kind of caricatures, but if there's like the philosophical person who that's kind of just something that's part of their mojo, that's kind of the thing that they just feel a gravity towards, okay? And they are sitting there with just a group of kind of people who are at some, like it also depends on the context of the event. Are we at somebody's house? Is it a Thanksgiving meal? Like it depends. But if somebody speaks just out of a place of, oh, like nobody else is understanding the depths of this, then that's not going to work. Like that's bad. That's like kind of doing a direction of philosophy in a bad way, like the Humean bad philosophy. But I think it would be the Humean good philosophy to be able to sit there and sometimes actually just be quiet. But sometimes it's like you put out little baits, like it's not that you're trying to like catch anybody in, but it's just kind of like you're just sharing some of the things that are in your head. And maybe some people will want to take that and like ride with it and play with it, and they want to engage. But it's funny because a lot of times you'll kind of see, or I don't know, maybe Daniel and I sort of see how, we'll be sitting with some people, and it's like, I think this can happen. Again, it depends on the context. It depends on if it's like family people you've been with your whole life. And so they just sort of like, oh, they're that person goes again with their philosophical thing, they make sort of a jest about it. Like, oh, okay, we're getting deep now sort of thing. But it is funny how people can talk all day, for the most part, in small talk, can talk about, the sports games, they can talk about the movies, they can talk about this other stuff. But as soon as you start maybe talking about some of those ideas or some of the like kind of underlying assumptions and going there, it may or may not be received very well. And sometimes it's just outright dismissed and thought of as like, oh, well, there they go again. And like, they don't really want to be here. Why not? Why can't that be being there too? Why can't it all be being there? Like, it's okay. We can just do it differently. But I do think that generally speaking, the question to kind of go back to the idea of like philosophy taking people away from relationships. I mean, yeah, but like Daniel said, like being an intramural soccer team can. I mean, okay, so, so it's like, I think maybe perhaps there's a frustration with how philosophy can sometimes be done, but anything can be done that way, whatever it is. And I think we have to learn how to sublate any of those areas, whether it's intramural soccer or it's philosophy, in a way that allows us to be more present with the people around us, to become more aware of, is it the right time to actually bring up Kant right now or not, and to sort of be able to be more playful and hopefully that be more enjoyable as a person to other people, but also to be able to enjoy the atmosphere, which might mean being silent, which might mean being feeling very alone in that. But I think that makes me think of Rilke's distinction between like loneliness and solitude. Trying to think about loneliness in a way that maybe this is actually something so novel that I am the only one who can experience it. I think that's such a beautiful way to think about it, Andrew, for like seeing it as, wow, maybe this is something like I have to in a way feel lonely in order to also feel this incredible appreciation or this kind of strange, interesting unity with so many other people. So it's kind of like, yeah, it's a little bit of a drawback, but let's look at the positive of that. Like, let's look at the incredible mind-boggling aspect of it. And I know that when I've gotten stuck in like the loneliness, it's like, whoa, just it's so bad. It's self-enclosing. It makes you feel so desperate. Why not shift it a little bit, just a little, and then it can really be able to open us up to maybe I'm actually developing solitude right now, which is a healthy ability to be with myself. So anyways, those are some thoughts that came to mind. But yeah, really happy to be here, guys. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful. And maybe there's a part of it where philosophy is experienced as destructive, like you're undermining beliefs, or it's experienced as hitting a membrane that they can't enter. So that's then interpreted as bad. I mean, it should be noted, I'll pass it to Tyler and then Mr. Ebert. A lot of people who do philosophy actually feel that the lack of philosophy is oppressive, like the anti-philosophy. Like if you bring up a question, then there's a kind of kicking out that occurs. Whereas philosophy is actually inviting to relationship because it allows people to talk about ideas or what they're thinking or different things. And it's interesting as well because there's always small groups, diners, people that can be met. I mean, a lot of people who do philosophy know that 99% of their conversations are not philosophy. It's just in the online spaces that they're actually able to meet people that are interested and want to talk about those different things, and iron sharpens iron and different things like that. But it also kind of just speaks to how basically anything can keep out relationship or be a boundary. Even people obsessed with relationships can actually bound out relationships because there's some sort of like creating an idolatry out of it or an idolatry out of emotion. So it's interesting that everything has that quality. But maybe one of the reasons philosophy gets kind of called out is particularly having the capacity to identify that capacity in everything. And that's too dangerous. So, there's a particular wanting to get it out of the way. Because, if you start asking, okay, well, you say you love someone, what does it mean to love someone? Oh, frick, you're actually threatening my understanding of all my love relationships because I thought I loved all these people. And if we arrive at a different understanding of it, then I might have to re-examine what I'm doing in the world. So maybe that's another reason why it's seen so threatening and why then we view it as antisocial because it has that antisocial sort of structure versus seeing as it having this unique capacity of intimacy. But let me give it to Tyler and Mr. Ebert. Tyler Murphy, please.
I wanted to read this little paragraph from Lacan on love, because it has so much to do with love and wisdom. So he says here, note that whereas Plato, at least in the guise of, I don't know how to pronounce this exactly, but Diotima, which I think is, or Diotama, which I think is Socrates dressed up as a woman. Correct me if you know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but anyways, so whereas Plato, at least in the guise of Diotama, took love to be a means to an end, that end being knowledge or wisdom, in psychoanalysis, love is viewed not merely as a helpmate, the motor force of the analysand's exploration of the unconscious. I want to actually stop there for a second because in my experience with the analyst I've been talking with, there was this really beautiful moment where I was talking and talking and talking, and then I stopped and I was like, I don't know, what do you think, Marcus? And he goes, no, go, keep going. And that love of like, I genuinely at least get the sense, and maybe this is all the transference that's happening, that he actually does, like, he wants to know what I have to talk about. And that, I just want to say too, that's something that I see, that I experience here on the net, that I just have to commend all of you guys for, but especially Daniel and Michelle, like this encouraging of, hey, no, like keep talking. What you said there was brilliant. And how in the end though, the end is is not knowledge or wisdom, but actually love. So he says, indeed, Erik Erikson quoted Freud, perhaps apocryphally, as saying that analysis took it as its goal to allow the patient to love and work, not to know all about himself or about anything else for that matter. In psychoanalysis, knowledge and understanding are not ends in themselves. Love is. And there's something about my experience anyways in just these last couple months, even if it were to end this bit of analysis, that it's changed my towardness in regards to listening, I think, anyways, and relating to other people of not trying to overcode another's experience by quickly relating it back to my experience, but being someone who can, like my analyst or like how I see you guys operating here on the net, keep going. That's interesting. Explore that further. So anyways, just wanted to throw that in here. My roommate wants to say hi too. So, howdy guys.
What's going on? No, thank you for sharing that. He's sitting in on the net. It's a good way to spend an afternoon. Good man. No, well, it's funny on what you're saying, because I think, and then I'll give it to Mr. Ebert, is that there's a concept in which, like, people, there's this kind of idea that we just know how to relate. We just know how to talk. We just know how to love. Then you go to a therapy, psychoanalysis, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have no idea. You're like, oh, well, I know how to love. I know how to think. And then you do philosophy and be like, oh my gosh, my thinking had a million assumptions in it. And I think what's just so interesting is I think a lot of people, one of the reasons I do philosophy is because you realize, and Mr. Stanley, good to see you, sir. Everyone pick up his poetry collection. If for anything, the beginning part where he's talking about Heidegger and the Kyoto School and all of the thinking together is extraordinary. And then the history of Japanese poetry is remarkable. So Mr. Stanley, it's a pleasure, sir. And like one of the reasons I do it is because you like realize, oh my gosh, I am so prone to project onto people, to assume I know what people think, that I have to be regularly thinking about thinking, not to fall into those mistakes, to actually have that opening to the other, or to experience the other, or to be able to create membranes that aren't like hard walls that don't let anyone in, or to be able to experience diversity and actually be open to diversity. You start to realize, oh my gosh, I as a human being am prone to so many mistakes without even knowing I'm committing those mistakes, that you look for a different quality of interaction and quality of speaking to make sure you don't fall into those things. And I think a lot of people, like, if you're doing like philosophical reasoning, not because you're in an academic, not because it's your job or something, it's from this sense of desperation, this sense of something happening. It can be a desperation, or this sort of sense of this is really important because of what I as a human being am prone to. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Thank you. I have COVID, so my vibe is going to be a little different today. It's freezing here. Yeah, I think this is a good topic. I want to paint a story about this. Not a story, but I think it makes so much sense, right? We want to relate. We want to belong, first of all. We want to experience an interiority. We want to experience an interior, not unlike the interior we were born from, the womb, the safest place we've ever known, where we had no even sense of exterior, or just pure interiority. And in some ways, that's the longing. That's the longing for love that never stops and is never quenched, because it can't be quenched, because we're now stuck in this world of interiors and exteriors. And so we try and acquire love or expand our interiority into the exterior by acquiring lovers or property or influence, feeling, or fame is a great extension of interiority, where you feel like the whole world becomes your interior, and so on. And of course, so that's the fundamental thing to me. And And then we can talk about, oh, I want to feel connection to people. Okay, well, that's related to this desire to feel interior. And then how do I know that I'm connecting to people? Well, their feedback. I get some semblance of their feedback. As a philosopher, how do I know I'm a successful philosopher? Well, feedback from other people, right? It's really working for them, right? They let me know that, hey, that was really interesting. This is really working. Hey, and it's spreading. And Peter Limberg, who I think some of us know and is a friend, he just put out this thing about a minimum viable philosophy, MVP. Now, he's stealing it from Silicon Valley, which is a minimum viable product. The minimum viable product in Silicon Valley terms is this thing where it's the lean startup model, basically, where you come up with an idea and you throw it out there, you create an MVP. Instead of building the whole structure or the whole building, you build a model of the building, and then you see if you can get some adoption from a user base. And if you do get adoption on the MVP, the beta, let's say, then all of a sudden you should be pouring money into it, and you turn that MVP into a proper product. So a minimum viable product becomes a maximal product if the MVP is successful. Now, the reason people do that is to not put too much capital and effort into the initial idea if the initial idea doesn't work, and it allows them to pivot really quickly, right? Now, he's floating a minimum viable philosophy. Now, sounds really good, right? Of course, you know where I'm going, right? So this sounds all really good. You're getting immediate feedback. You're closing the loop between your expression and the feedback you're getting so that you know whether or not you should pivot to a different philosophy. You're starting to see the problem? When we focus on feedback as the guiding force to our philosophical endeavors, suddenly we no longer have our own instinct at play. We simply have the feedback of others to determine whether or not we are promoting an interesting philosophy. Now, you only recognize this problem, I think. You can recognize it in abstract terms like we are right now, but you only really viscerally recognize this problem once you're successful at this particular game. Because once you're successful at this particular game, then you actually experience the audience capture that occurs as a result of gaming this system of feedback. And it's one of the reasons I don't even want to play live anymore, because I don't want the immediate feedback of the audience letting me know whether or not they like a moment. There's a certain aloneness that is simply fucking prerequisite to developing ideas and creative thoughts. If you're not into that, I just watched Maestro, and it's fine, whatever. I'm not promoting the movie, but there's a great part in it where he says something like, Leonard Bernstein is really. And I knew this because my dad is an opera maniac, so I already knew this story. But Leonard has this crossroads constantly in his life where he could have been either the greatest conductor in American history or the greatest composer in American history. But to be a composer, you have to be alone. And he keeps saying this in the movie. He's like, my problem is I like people too much. In fact, my problem is I don't know how to be alone. And that's what he ends up coming to at the end, is that he likes being around people so much that he's afraid of being alone. And because he's afraid of being alone, he can't compose. He can only conduct and teach. Now, that's fine. I think that's a wonderful thing to do, right? Like, if you've ever seen Leonard Bernstein's Harvard seminars, I think they're Harvard. They're incredible, philosophically rich, beautiful things. You look him up online. He's talking to the students. He's wonderful at it. He's a teacher. But he doesn't give himself enough time to compose. So anyway, all that to say that when we think about, when we bring philosophy too much into the scope of feedback and interpersonal and how do we talk to other people, we start to just become life coaches. We almost enter a pyramidal scheme of life coach world And I think that that's dangerous. And so I'm actually quite against a minimum viable philosophy, because I don't think that we should be necessarily iterating based on user feedback. I think that's sort of like problematic. So anyway, good to be here.
Well, don't die. Don't freeze to death, and don't die from COVID, please. And I really appreciate that comment. And no, it's interesting because there always is. It is interesting, and I voiced it too because the main philosopher I work with for so many years is David Hume. Is the concern of this bad philosophy, and it's interesting how there's this sense almost where it has to be noted that philosophy can be bad. So let's figure out a way to have a minimum viable philosophy. Let's figure out how not to be abstract. All of that has a certain wisdom to it, because we can get, as we were saying, we can get too far on the side of the wisdom side of the love of wisdom and not enough on the love side. But then you can turn around and be too far side on the love side, and that would be an example of where you're using love because you're afraid to be alone. And that is a real problem today. And I think also we have to be aware on if our thinking about philosophy is informed by what Susan King at one time called the extrovert ideal of America, which is that anything that is extroverted is kind of moral and good, and anything that's more introverted is seen as evil and suspicious and problematic. Because there is something fundamental here about the necessity of being alone. And you could argue too that people who don't know how to be alone are some of the hardest people to have like relationships with, right? Because there's a certain attachment. So there's some sort of necessity of being able to be alone that requires the cultivation of the kind of person that is actually able to do the creation or to think through something entirely. And Chetan, good to see you, sir. I'll pass it to Mr. Lou, but what you were saying made me think about, I've known a lot of people who say when they were writing a short story, instead of saying, well, I don't want to write the whole story if people aren't going to like it, so let me do the first paragraph and give it to people and see what they say. And they never made it. They all quit. Where one of the things almost for me is very important. It's like, I'm going to finish the entire thing and then I'll give it to people. And of course, that meant you wrote a lot of bad things or things that people didn't like. But it was almost like that was incredibly necessary. Like there were entire, like very long philosophy papers that later on I'm like, oh, this is wrong. It's entirely wrong. And you had to throw it back. And in the back of your mind, there is the creeping thought of, oh, well, maybe if I would have like given it to people or spent more time talking or thinking before I started writing, I wouldn't have wasted all that time. But I guess over the years, increasingly more and more, I'm convinced that that is a necessary part of the process of finishing things, not getting feedback, living with them, dwelling of them. And that means you're going to write entire books that suck. That means you're going to do entire papers that are not good. And yet that in of itself is necessary in some profound way. There's something about the profound risk that also cuts, you can't, because it's almost like, I almost want to call it irredeemable risk. Because like, if you're alone and you're not hanging out with people, you can't say, well, at least I was creating friends. It's like, no, you were alone writing a paper for years that wasn't good. It's irredeemable. And it's almost like we want to go, well, if you gave feedback to people, at least it could facilitate relationships. And even if it was bad, it contributed to community. So it's still good. It's almost like one of the reasons this loneliness is so necessary is because there's something about being willing to entirely throw yourself into something that could be a kind of irredeemable loss or waste in a way. The very willingness to do that seems necessary in some way. And if you're not willing to do that because you want the feedback, you want to make sure you don't make any mistakes, then you never enter that space that seems necessary for the cultivation of something. And it's just very interesting because it's like you have to do that. And if you're looking for that minimum viable philosophy or minimal viable feedback, yeah, I get it maybe more in a business context because there's limited money, you have to go through the taxes. I understand all those things, but there's something about creativity like philosophy that really requires this throwing yourself entirely into and having that loneliness that at the end of the day, you can't necessarily rationalize or redeem. You just have to say, well, it wasn't any good. I spent a long time alone on something that was not good. That seems necessary. And so I appreciate what you're saying. Let me give it to Mr. Luber and pass it. Mr. Luber, please. And don't die, Mr. Ebert. Do not die. Mr. Luber.
Ebert, I thought that was great. a few things. Well, first, it's making me think of a little bit, Jock, in that TikTok that you sent me. Fantastic. Thank you for sending me that TikTok. Yeah, I think, well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is a hypothetical. What if you're creating, you're giving out your product, however that is, and there's there's feedback, but to refer to what Tyler was saying, there's a lack of keep going. Like they talk, they clap, they do the necessary things to interpret it as feedback, but there's a lack of a keep going. In that scenario, when there's like a lack of a keep going, to me, that's because the whole situation is like almost like lacking some internal loneliness. Like, I think the whole idea of like just like word vomit, just you keep talking about what you're thinking or what you're taking in is a byproduct of having the loneliness, the lonely time to breathe, to process, to take in. And I think, like, to reference what I was saying, like when I was like out Saturday night and I'm talking, there's almost like I can't say keep going to people for two reasons. There's like the music is drowning me out, so I can't say keep going. Or from a dancing standpoint, maybe I'm not able to keep up with the other people dancing to allow them to keep dancing on me, so to speak. So I think that's just the first thing, that there's feedback and then there's like an excess of feedback. And I think that excess of feedback is a byproduct of people being able to be lonely to take in the product. The second thing is creating for the audience, or like creating for the feedback. I think if you're in a position where that is the primary thinking in your creation, you're already missing the mark. Like, I think we talked about this, I forget which net, maybe it was like the last net, but when you're creating, it's like you are the first audience, you are the first feedback. It's not like, it's like a different position. It's not that you're thinking about what you're making and getting feedback on. It's like you're giving the idea that you discovered feedback. So it's like a different dynamic where you're like almost like startled. It's like the discovery like throws you off, where you have to give it feedback in order to realign yourself with the idea, in order to actually take in the idea in its fullness. Or get closer, your alignment is closer to the fullness of the idea. I don't know if you could ever fully take in an idea, but yeah, I just think there's how you see yourself in the unfolding of creation, and understanding that the audience is last in your thinking is, I think, the way to not even care about the feedback. Like, I've heard like people that make movie, it's like, yeah, I'll go make a movie and then I'll go sit in the theater and I'll watch people react and that kind of stuff. That always freaked me out, because it's to me, it's just, what is that helping? Like, how are you what is your creation, like your creative process reflecting on their reaction? It's like, you could be making something where, I'm just being crude here, you think it's funny, but people think it's horrifying. Like, is that going to change your initial, like, you thinking that it's funny and that's why you're making it? No, it's like, you think it's funny and that's why you made it. Even though, just to be clear, I don't agree with making something for the sake of it being funny. I'm just saying that for the sake of getting the point across of the emotive reactions have nothing to do with your initial emotive reaction to the discovery of the idea. They're almost separate. The only thing that's the same is that there's a reaction. The reaction is the only thing that to me is the same. But the particular reaction, it's like, who cares? I care. But like, I totally get it from like playing live music where it's like the reaction's so visceral that it's hard for it to not affect you in a certain sense. So that makes perfect sense. And like, I've never heard of an artist being like, I don't want to perform live. I don't want to get that reaction. But like, I always would hear that and be like, I want to perform live. I want to perform live. And it's like, well, when you initially discovered your song or the music, whatever, you were by yourself. There was no live performance. There was no other people watching you discover it. It was all within your own world. And so in that sense, why on earth do you focus on the live performance when what that performance is based off has nothing to do with the actual creation of the product that you're performing? So I think that was a really wise thing to say, and I honestly feel like most musicians should understand that perspective a bit more, referring to what Ebert was saying. But I'll pass it off. Yeah.
No, it's very interesting because it's making me think that the problem of feedback is kind of underthought in some respects. Because, you know, there's one side of it where you say, I don't care what other people think, so you make junk. Then there's another side of it that says, I only care what people think, and you make junk. And then there's some sort of way to know how to care what people think that is relative to your own values that pushes you toward mastery. There's a really interesting kind of problem because I think about like, you know, who could provide feedback for James Joyce? Well, it looked like he had to hang out with Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Virginia Woolf, right? Like they had to hang out with other people who were able to provide feedback on that level, right? But then there's also something that, you know, if in first grade you write a story and the fact your teacher goes, I like this, then maybe helps you commit to the craft because you're like, oh, maybe I'm good at this. And so there's something here about different levels and kinds of feedbacks at different states, maybe. Because in one way, what Mr. Lindbergh is saying about, hey, don't go write, you know, some massive philosophical tome, and then it turns out that it's just useless, so you ought to try to get some feedback. But then there's also a problem of, you know, if James Joyce is getting feedback from Hemingway and different people, that's great. But if you're getting feedback from anyone, that may not be good because then you're just going to make a philosophy that people like, which then probably is going to be serving some ideological project. But then at the same time, there's a way in which what Mr. Lindbergh is saying makes sense. It just depends on what we mean by it. And I almost want to say there's a difference between feedback that threatens the commitment. Like, there's a lot of people, it's like, let me get feedback. I wrote something. I don't want to waste my time. Let me see what people think. Oh, it sucks. And it's almost like they're looking for a rationalization not to throw themselves into something entirely. Like, that seems to be the dangerous kind of feedback where you're saying, oh, they said it wasn't good. Okay, well, I shouldn't do writing then because I'm not good at it. Well, there's a certain sort of escapism that is occurring there. So maybe it's something about feedback that threatens the commitment versus feedback for the honing of the craft. Because it's like feeding back, like food back, the food you give them, this kind of thing. I'm wondering about this because and that probably too is part of the relation between philosophy and relationships. What is the feedback that you're looking for in that way? But Mr. Luber and then Mr. Jocham and Mr. Ebert. So Mr. Luber, please.
Sorry, let me just squeeze in. I think what you just touched on relates to the earlier part of the conversation, where it's like when you're in a crowd and you're feeling lonely, and it's really you're just so immersed in that experience. It's like when you have like a partner, it means that like they have situated themselves in a way where they have like they're on the same stratosphere of immersion. So when you're looking for feedback, it's like you're looking for a partner in the same sense. You're looking for someone that was able to create their position from a similar position as you. And that's the difference between the feedback between, you know, a good feedback versus the bad feedback of like just the audience just giving you an excess of feedback and it throwing you off kind of thing. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that relation is, I think, very similar. Feedback and like and partner, like in life partner. So yeah.
That's very interesting. So feedback is finding a partner. That's an interesting framer versus feedback as fear-based, trying to avoid making a mistake, trying to make sure that people are happy. There's some sort of like feedback as searching for a partner. That's an interesting framing. Let me give it to Mr. Jochen and Mr. Ebert. Mr. Javier Rivera, good to see you, sir. And I'll pass it to Mr. Jochen. Mr. Jochen, I hope you're doing well, sir.
Yeah, my internet's down, so I have to call him from my phone. Feedback. So I teach. So this is like the top in the art design program. So this is something that resonates very well with my practice and with students working with them. I think the first part is right, Daniel. I think your idea of that kind of speculative risk of the creative act is 100% accurate. Right? It's actually very similar to telling jokes. A joke doesn't work if you're looking for if people give you to explain the joke, or you're looking for the reassurance that you're funny about the joke as you do it. It doesn't work that way. The joke completely loses all its power when you're in that reactive state of seeking out a response from everybody, versus a joke when it's just flowing out and it's almost indifference. It's almost an imposition onto reality. And generally great art and great ideas have that effect. They're almost like these objects of imposition that it's not that it reacts to everything around it, everything reacts to it. It's the exact inverse of the relationship. How often have we not had a great conversation where there's just this striking image of an idea that you're just like, whoa, it just boop, it just did a whole cathartic just spin out on everything that was just said, where we're going, and then every implication from that. Great art does that. You walk into a room, it's it's like this kind of slam in the face of reality blasted at you. That is absolutely not the state of, is this good enough? What do you think about it? And I bring this up because most people are horrible at critique at feedback. And the reason why is generally people will normally diagnose at a first order level. I don't like this color. I don't like this word. They're looking at the most minutiae detail, and then even worse, will then try to prescribe the solution immediately to that particular element. When in reality, that it might be a second order or a tertiary effect. That's the actual question. So, for example, if a certain color in a composition isn't working, well, what is its relationship to the other colors? It might not be the individual color that's the problem. It might be that color in relationship to the ground around it. It may not have contrast, for example. It might be too warm. It might be too cool. It might be too saturated. It might be too desaturated, etc. So that'd be a second order jump. A third order would be, what are we trying to do with this piece? What's the intention behind it? What is the relationship between the intention versus the application? And then the audience's response to or resonance to it. So really now we've gone to 3 levels of investigation just on that one example. The answer you give to just discussing which level of investigation you're talking about completely changes the response. And a lot of times just talking it out loud, usually what happens up happening is it's like the unsuccessfulness of a work is because there's a secondary or tertiary order problem. There's a contradiction, or there's some tension that isn't being resolved, that just you can't even really prescribe the answer. It has to just be discussed. And this actually I was going to say originally about language games of philosophy, there's a very big difference between a reified mode of, Platonism versus Aristotelianism versus materialism versus idealism, like these isms, these abstractional notions, versus what does Plato actually say? What does Aristotle actually say? I bring this up because I've been in reading groups where we're reading secondary literature about a piece, and I definitely had the thought in my mind, why don't we just read the original? Even if it's just a translation, even if we accept that a translation in English is still a reading through, if we accept that, why not we just do that and just call it and just get moving there? That is a very different operation of philosophy than you working at these secondary and tertiary abstractions, and then you're having kind of these things getting in the way, versus what is philosophy? It gets a little complicated, but is it not probably dialectic, syllogisms, and maybe analogy? Probably the 3 kind of ways I had to summarize it. What's the art of what philosophy tries to do? So to close with this, because that idea of isolation versus solitude, right? it does take a real stance of courage to be willing to cultivate some object of power, right, in art or thought or creation of some kind, that you're willing to birth out into the world, basically. You're willing to generate out, that will have this kind of resonating effect on other people. And I'm using that word resonate in a very intentional way. Like, this is, so the feedback is more that resonance, that it kind of hits on, it kind of grabs onto other people. And where it hits, it's kind of not really known until you generate the work, ultimately. And I think it's funny because I know there's a little tangent note about love that was brought up, and Dall-E from Symposium was brought up. I'm going to close on this one note. I'm talking about it now, and it's going to be in my lecture course. There's a really interesting point in the discussion between Dall-E and the younger Socrates that's being retold in Symposium, where it's posited, if love is a love of something, so it's a love of possession of some kind. It was brought up before, I think, by Tyler, about basically unity, right? Basically brought back to the womb condition of safety and things like that. Like, that's one mode of it. But the question was, Dall-E asked Socrates, the younger one, what will he have who gets beautiful things? Basically, the possession of the good is a possession of something is what love is for. And if it's beautiful things, Socrates can't answer it. He's struggling. He cannot find the answer. Dall-E then says, okay, you can't get it. Imagine the object is changed and the inquiry is made about the good instead of the beautiful. Come, Socrates, tell me now, what is the love of the lover of good things? That's a really powerful, I think people completely underestimate what happened there. So this discussion was really about the beautiful and its relationship to love. And then it switched out halfway through the discussion to be about the good and the possession of good things. There's a conclusion of that is about it's the everlasting possession of the good. That's what the answer or discussion works through with that. I just bring this up because that operation, what love is meant to do, and what the desire has a certain effect on what they're focusing on and what they gain out of it. There's a lot of subtleties in there, and how love and knowledge, they're both kind of relatives in a way. I say that because I brought in other points, like the love is this kind of indefinite intermediate. That's what's talked about in Symposium. But knowledge is also actually indefinite knowledge, like as a generic term, is also an indefinite relation. It's only when it's particularized to a specific discipline, grammar, etc., that it has any kind of concreteness of a specific habituation for individuals to enact. So even our kind of relationship of how love and knowledge work, they're really in one way not very, very different. That's a tangent note. I totally admit that, just kind of spinning through what I heard. But the click note is just this real risk that's required for feedback, like for feedback to actually be useful, requires a certain capital risk of a practitioner to generate out something with indifference to basically anybody else. But yet at the same time, there has to be this resonance of a certain kind of individual, even willing to be able to engage with it, as Daniel, you said before. And that's what I got.
No, it's outstanding. And I'm just, this point on it's so difficult to get good feedback. Well, it makes me think, like, if I think about what made me read books or think thoughts or want to have conversations, it was partly tied. One, when I was really young, I realized I would actually never be able to look at my own face. I was like 5 and this terrified me. I was like, oh my gosh, all I can look in a mirror, but it's not actually my face. It's just an image. That really freaked me out. But it was also this kind of realization that I am stuck inside of my own head. Like, I can only experience the world through my consciousness. And I can even ask questions like, do other minds exist? And I'm like, well, I'm screwed if they don't, because my ideas of what I think is good tend to not be. My ideas of how to live a good life tend to be bad. My ideas of how to relate with people tend to be bad. And there's this kind of idea of this desperate need to really listen to other people or think thoughts, because your brain is always closing off too early and trapping you in yourself. And this constant, just when I think I know what love is, I better go read these other people. Because, we did so much in literature. Like Chekhov once said that, the key to understand people who love one another is that they're constantly misunderstanding one another. Or this kind of idea that the people who love each other tend to treat each other the worst. Or David Foster Wallace saying you have to fight everything within you to not just think about the world according to your own head. And like you start and you realize I'm really bad at giving myself feedback actually on when I'm doing that, when I think that. So how do I find feedback from a world that I experience as truly other and external to me that can help me get out of this kind of necessary experience of reality according to my own thoughts and mind? Like this reaching of an outside that is so incredibly difficult that it requires this perpetual check. And this is why things like beauty is interesting to me. Things like creativity are interesting to me because it feels like something beyond you is capturing you. And it's not just yourself. And beauty feels external to yourself. And philosophy, when you're having a conversation, you have ideas from people that you've never had. So there probably are other people out there. And there probably are other minds that can feed. And it's like this constant, it's interesting to me. And then I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert and then Mr. Javier Rivera, is because for me, a lot of the reading and the thinking has always been tied to this problem of being stuck in your own head. Like you can only experience the world through your consciousness. So you are set up to fail. You are screwed. So unless there is a perpetual seeking of feedback, that's like, it's interesting because it is like looking for good feedback on your experience of the reality, other people who can provide good feedback. But then of course, the quality of that feedback is the quality of the other people that you are dealing with. So you have to look for people that can do with these kind of things. Mr. Jockin, please.
Quick intercession. I remember our conversation last week or 2 weeks ago about emotion, right? That basically it's like that the existence of emotional states in us is actually a proof demonstration of an external reality. If emotion is explicitly basically the dysregulation or disruption of you're basically an internal model state versus external stimulus. Just want to point that note because that was from you, Daniel, last week.
No, I think that's exactly right. And so seeking the emotion and then having the feedback to know what it means or how to experience, et cetera, so forth. I think that is all so critical. But no, I appreciate that comment. And it just, to me, there's always this problem of I am stuck in my head. So how do I get feedback against that? And that being such a lifelong problem that if you don't face, you tend to be bad at relationships, life choices, all sorts of different things. But you also don't even have the feedback to realize you're bad at those things. And it's just such a deep problem. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert and then Javier. Mr. Ebert, please.
Right on. Lot to respond to. Right. Here I am. Okay. Not to start a war with Thomas, but regarding comedy, actually the opposite is the case. And if you study comedy like I do, because I'm a huge fucking comedy buff, jokes are whittled down based on the binary feedback of laughter versus not killing. It killed versus it didn't kill. And you take a joke, and a lot of the best comedians still do this. You take the joke on paper and you go do these small gigs in hole in the walls and see how they react. And then you keep whittling them, change a couple words. And then the performance, the mastery is then making the joke seem the way that Thomas then described the joke, which is occurring in the middle of the moment without fear or without any sense of whether or not the audience is going to interact. It just feels like it's coming to you live. Never mind, they've done 87 dates across the country where they're slowly whittling this thing down based on the binary affect within the audience of knee-jerk laughter versus not knee-jerk laughter. And I think that laughter and comedy has always struck me as a performer as the most severe binary feedback context you can possibly engage yourself in. Because if you're a musician, you can interpret silence as anything. You could be like, wow, I really got him thinking this time. But in comedy, unless you're Andy Kaufman, the feedback is purely a binary of laughter versus like silence. And then there's a gradient in between. Andy Kaufman or someone can like play with that and be like, okay, I really like that I'm making people uncomfortable right now. And there's a negative feedback, which I interpret as positive feedback. And you can do that as, I think the more you develop as an artist, the more you need to rely on, or a philosopher, especially as a philosopher, the more you need to rely on the idea that negative feedback is positive feedback. Like they just don't get it. Do you know what I mean? Of course they don't get it. Like you suddenly need that almost, whether or not it reflects a truth is almost irrelevant. You need that to insulate yourself because the brutality of sharing something that is not immediately accepted and loved. I loved what Andrew was saying, that an audience, that they're, in theory, just if we're talking geometrically, like if you're going to offer a substance, the object into which you're offering it must be not full. Let's just say, and that there must be some preceding lack, or there must be some, I mean, you could say that what you're offering is a disruption of their fullness, or of their saturated sort of like automaticity, their subconscious automatic, which everyone is sort of in this sort of somniferous gaze. But I wanted to talk also about so I probably disappeared, but you can still hear me because I see you nodding. I would like to contradict. Basically, I'm just going to spend this whole time contradicting everything everyone said. I don't think people are mostly in their own minds. So I don't think that the idea is with philosophy to get out of your own mind. I think it's quite the opposite. I think most people are in the intersubjective mind, or in the ideology, the unquestioned, and really the way we become things, the way we become quote unquote individuals, is through this mimetic process of feedback. So the whole time from the moment we're being given cues, feedback cues, mimetic cues to imitate those around us. And oh, that's very good. Yes, that is you. That's bad. I mean, we literally grow into the cultural beings we are vis-a-vis feedback, and we become what, ourselves, because we're constantly being told what's good and what's bad by other people. I think what we become is the sort of amalgam of the feedback of others in a lot of ways. And that the process of philosophy is the process of interjecting into the, what I would just basically call the automatism, or the automaticity of the collective mind, or the hive mind, or just the energy preservation that is required to sustain a membrane in the first place, which is to make every operation as automatic as possible, so that you're preserving as much energy, and thereby you're creating a model of the world where, again, I know I beat this to death, but where cup is cup, and where I don't any longer go, what is this cup? Right? I have it as a subconscious operation. I create an automatic interaction with my environment so that I can preserve energy, because that's fucking life, is the exchange between energy expenditure and energy preservation, and the mind needs to negotiate that expenditure just like everything else does. So it needs to create as much as possible, needs to be automatic. And in some ways, what philosophy is the expression of will as no. Like, I was in this Cadell's thing the other day, and I guess, Thelema, the idea of thy will, let thy will be the love, or some shit. I can't remember what Crowley says, but anyway, I would say, or do as thy will be the whole of the law. Yeah. And instead, it's really do not as thy will. In other words, stopping the incessancy of automatic behavior, which we get in so many ways from this incessant growth of feedback from our environment. I mean, literally, this is feedback. Like grabbing this and being like, yes, this is the thing I thought it was. This is giving me the assurance that this is a cup, which is essentially just, feedback. And then stopping that and being like, wait a minute, what is this actually? Cup, 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 right? I put myself in the place of semantic saturation, aka semantic satiation, and all of a sudden cup is no longer cup, it's back into the indeterminacy of what the fuck is this. And that's philosophy, is like not like almost disconnecting from the feedback web of the cultural apparatus to be like, wait a minute, I'm going to detach and maybe become not myself or become a real individual, but at the very least detach from the feedback web which has literally created my mind. And that there's something about moving away from feedback and into something else. I don't know what we want to call it, but into or out of the fucking matrix, to be, you know, that guy. But there's something about that. Lastly, with regard to feedback, I don't know what this means. I just find it interesting. There's 3 variations of feedback. One, of course, creates distortion. If you've ever taken a guitar and you put it near the thing, you get too much feedback, it creates distortion, which is isomorphic to silence. So there's a dynamic saturation that occurs when you have an excess of feedback. It literally kills you, right? So to Luber's point. Then there are 2 other things. One is a null wave. It's called a destructive. Sorry, I wrote this down actually. It's called a destructive. Right, of course. So there, one, I usually just call it a null, because in music you call it a null. I don't know if you've ever arranged your speakers and suddenly in a certain place in the room you can't feel bass, for instance. Well, it's because the waveforms are placed such that there's a null. It's called a destructive interference, where the waveforms suddenly cancel one another out. Noise canceling headphones sort of operate on this principle. So it's a destructive interference. And then the other is a constructive interference nonetheless, but where 2 waves combine to make a louder wave than would be possible by simply adding the 2 waves together. They're like not exponentially louder, but like anyway, it's a fascinating sort of like moment. If you take 2 identical waveforms, for instance, just place them over one another, they tend to have that effect where they're just like the perception of loudness grows beyond double. And I guess that's what we all kind of want, right? Is the constructive interference, where it's like secretly, and what we're always managing when we're sharing anything, we want the response. Like right now, what I actually want is for everyone to just be applauding right now, right? Just like, oh my God, people popping champagne. They're just like, did you hear what Ebert just said? Can I go next? And the only thing you guys want to talk about is how brilliant what I just said was, right? But I have to manage that desire. And the way that we manage these things is interesting. Like Luber mentioned, I know a lot of actors and musicians. I won't read any reviews. I don't want to hear good reviews. I don't want to hear bad reviews. I don't want to hear any reviews. My manager, I'll be like, no, I don't want to know. I don't want to know about it, because I don't even want to get in the mind frame where I'm thinking about that sort of thing. I don't want to even be desiring that sort of thing, you know, because it's like a disease. It really is powerful. Anyway, yeah, cool.
No, that's outstanding. And I'll pass it to Javier and Thomas Jacket. Well, it's very interesting. I guess for me, like when I say being an own head, I always make a distinction where there's absorbing the world around you without thinking about it, that then you're stuck not even realizing you've just absorbed the context, where you actually have to be alone to make a self that can exist in a relationship with the other world. Otherwise, you're just kind of absorbed into it. And I guess for me, when I say you're stuck in your own head, what I mean by that is that if you're just absorbed by the ideology around you, you are susceptible to not even realize you are so absorbed. So you have to create a feedback relationship, which strangely requires the creation of an interiority that can exist in a relationship with it, as opposed to just being absorbed by it. And that's what I mean. I mean, the point is very well taken. Like for me to say I'm stuck in my own head, what I mean by that is I'm stuck in my consciousness, my way of experiencing, that if I've just been absorbed absorbed by the world without existing in a relation to it. I don't even realize it. But this is what's so weird now, is because it's like, maybe the problem is not feedback, but the difference between absorbing that seems like feedback, but it's actually a lack of feedback by some sort of full saturation. I'm now interested in some sort of possible distinction there. But Ebert, please.
I was just going to say, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. So if we go back to this idea of feedback as distortion, and which, I don't know if anyone remembers my freak theory models, but I know you do, Daniel. And distortion, of course, like, we've all probably seen a distorted waveform. The valleys come up to the peaks because all the quiet bits come up to the loud bits, and you have a giant fat line, which is isomorphic to the flat line of silence. It is quite literally non-dynamical, aka basically dead. So you're basically brain dead in this idea when you have so much feedback from everyone else that your life is just being sort of guided by external feedback. And so when you say that you need to create a membrane, we could just think of that membrane as a what's the word I'm looking for? I'm a little brain dead right now, but it's basically a word that we use in the studio, that impedance. And actually, the mind, when I'm doing these EEG, because I'm making an EEG direct thought to music machine right now, what we're basically discovering is, I'm sure some people knew this already, but that the mind is basically an impedance mechanism, and in a Claude Shannon information theoretic way, where communication itself is about constraints of information rather than producing a positive piece of information out of the blue, like, I love you. The idea is that I love you is not a positivity that is produced out of a negativity, but rather a positivity which is produced by impeding the rest of the positivities. So taking away the rest of language so that one bit of language can produce itself and come forth. It's like the negativity is not negativity. The negativity is an excess, which needs to be displaced or otherwise impeded so that whatever you're communicating can come forth, and so on. So the brain is basically an impedance mechanism, which basically suppresses like too much so that something can come forward, etc. And that what it suppresses as too much, as you know, I believe, is the unconscious. So when we don't, because our own black box is the suppression of too much as the unconscious. So anyway, when you say that we need to create a sort of domain or a membrane of the self, which gives us some space or distance from the excessive feedback, really, of our external and especially the human world. I mean, we're constantly being told how to live. Status anxiety, everything is telling us how to operate. But if we create a bit of a barricade or an impedance mechanism or a membrane by which we have a bit of space to recreate a dynamism that is not flooded with feedback, but is rather able to detect what feedback is positive, what feedback is negative, what feedback is bullshit, what feedback to ignore, and so on, then all of a sudden we have a dynamic topology, or what would Vervaeke call it, salience mapping that is not simply flooded, that we actually can tarry with. So anyway, yeah, I just wanted to say all that.
No, I think that's brilliant. And like, when I hear Mr. Luber talk about the entertainment industry, it's like, how do we get the feedback to feel like what the audience wants so we can absorb into them? So there's no membrane, versus this kind of feedback where it's the acknowledgement of the distinction, but in a manner that almost creates more of a dance. And I'm almost wondering if you could talk about absorb, where you're just absorbed, so there's no membrane, that's bad. And then there's feedback, which requires some membrane, so there's a back and forth. And getting really good at that is almost like dance. Like the ability to like optimize feedback in a manner that doesn't erase the distinction, but also doesn't have it be like a hard wall where there's no relation. So maybe like when we think about philosophy, there's something about philosophy as the art of learning the membrane so that you can dance. as opposed to be absorbed or isolated. And that seems to be the proper role of feedback. Because like when I hear about the comedy example, like I remember we worked with a comedian, and there's this way where if you're too big on the audience, and when you first go up on the stage and you bomb, well, then you quit and you never do it again. So you have to have enough of a main brain to like bomb and not give up. But then it's almost like you get to the point where you're able to figure out the dance, which requires membrane. It's almost like absorb feedback dance. I'll have to think about it more, but the negotiation of a membrane so that dance is possible, if I just throw out a word right now. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera and then Mr. Jock. And Mr. Rivera, I hope you are doing well. I guess you're back in school now after winter break. I wish you the best with that, sir. I hope you are well.
Thank you. Thank you. Fundamentally, I think of similarly three kind of feedbacks. I would say, and this is what Buber would call the I-it world, where we construct our own self-identity, but it's always mediated through something else, right? This is when we're thinking something, being something. It's funny because actually we generally think of this as automatic. And so it's fascinating that Ebert calls the brain a kind of like impedance. And so it seems like by virtue of the brain and the way it acts as an impedance, it means that we fundamentally, our feedback is always mediated, right? You could say maybe this is the distortion part of it. Now, this other relation that Buber talks about with the I-thou, he really stresses the effort of the unmediated relationship, right? Unmediated feedback. What does that look like? The only hint that we have a sense of what it looks like is, for example, in these group settings, what's problematic about these group settings is that we hear something and then our brain starts going poof, like it just starts popping off. We're like, oh, that's a really interesting idea. And then you start through your self-consciousness, start thinking about what you're going to say next, right? But Buber would say you're not really listening. You're not really being present. You're not really being there. So all of a sudden, your interaction with these people are being mediated, right? It's an immediate impedance, and it happens all the time, dude. It happens all the time. But it's so entangled, and this is what we were talking about. The impedance can also temporarily be unmediated. You can impede the impedance, like do a paradoxical move where you just want to be present. And being present is like another form of basically impedance, right? You're choosing to block off everything else to have this genuine relation with somebody where you're not thinking about what you're trying to say. You're not thinking about what you're going to say next. You're not thinking about anything. You're just being there. And then that moment of response, Buber kind of notes, is really interesting. He goes, this is when you give a genuine response because you're not thinking about what you want to say or what you're going to say or what you're going to do. It's very unmediated. And of course, this is very difficult, but we have moments of this in our real life interactions, right? It fluctuates between this kind of moment of impeding, mediated relationships that are feedbacks, and then unmediated relations that are like a kind of like glimmer, where we kind of almost see like an authenticity of the otherness, which is definitely not the way our culture kind of understands authenticity, but of course, I think that whole fluctuation between the two, obviously, in my opinion, determines that results in a third kind of feedback, right? This fluctuation between a mediated feedback, unmediated feedback, and then this disruption that happens between the unmediated and mediated. So, yeah, I'm just gonna leave it there. That's the things that came to mind.
I think that is an excellent comment. I'll pass it to Mr. John, because there's always this weird tension. It's almost like conversation is a lifelong practice of membrane negotiation, which is when is it good to think about what I'm going to say, because what you're saying is really important and I want to make sure I have a good response. But at what point does that become I'm no longer hearing you and planning what to say? Maybe sometimes you get it right, other times you get it wrong. Maybe it takes 5 years to get better at it or something. Like there's this interesting problem of membrane negotiation, which is figuring out where to place the division. Because like you say, you're not fully present, but then there's a form of being fully present that is absorbing into the ideology or the total saturation. So you don't want that, but then you don't want such a hard membrane that it's a wall, and now you don't have a dance. And dance is always that metaphor I come back to, because it's a perpetual negotiation of give and take. Sometimes you take the lead, sometimes you get over, sometimes you plan what you're going to say, sometimes you don't. And then to go back to what I was saying, like the reason why it freaks, it's kind of freaky to think you're stuck in your own head is because if you are not negotiating it well, you are in a bad position to know that you're not negotiating it well because you're stuck in your own head, where by definition, if you put the membrane here versus here, you must have thought it was good to put it here, and yet you could be wrong. And it's almost that, and yet you could be wrong, that leads me into a perpetual like, oh, we got to keep thinking. We got to keep working and getting better and better and better, not because you're trying to be better, but so that the dance is better, if you will, so that the ability to have that kind of dance is better. But this is like an incredibly difficult art form that is not self-evident. And the moment you think it is self-evident, that could be your own brain telling you it's self-evident so that you're done, so that you think you've mastered it. But then there's also a weird ability to tell the longer you do it, if you're doing it well versus not. When you have an artist that's been doing something forever, they tend to be pretty good at judging when the painting is good versus not. And yet earlier, that same impulse of saying this is a good painting versus a bad one could have actually been very problematic because it was not trained. So there's something very, very difficult to navigate in all that. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Miss Michelle. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah. Now, by the way, I appreciate the challenge, what I said before. I think we're both wrong in a sense that what I should have done was to clarify. When I made this discussion about comedy, I meant improv. So I should have been more particular about what I meant by that. Because, yeah, totally. I mean, because the argument is basically the same as saying that fine art painting is the exhaustive of all what beautiful is. That's not true. And in fact, most of aesthetic theory does that wrong, is that they collapse it into a discussion of just painting or just fine art construction of what the beautiful is. Just like if you're saying stand-up comedy is the definition of what all comedy is, that's not, that's a reduction to what's really being discussed here. So that's an error on my part that I didn't specify what I meant about that. But granted, totally, the idea that there is absolutely some disciplines in both fields, in the arts and in comedy, where there is wholly prescription happening, heavy editing, heavy repetition over time. I meant to say improv comedy because of that exact point, that you literally, there is no pre-plan and there is complete uncertainty of what's going to play out. And it takes an incredible mastery to be willing to enter that space with the other comics in the room and to make something happen. That creates something that actually, by the way, I do appreciate what was said before. It was brought up kind of in tangent notes about information theory. It's this quality of surprise, because also the challenge Ebert meant about saying about the kind of being in your head versus basically the NPC quality, right? Is that most people have this NPC mode where literally their entire operations of tell me how to be as a human being is being told by external forces, external images. Versus what Daniel, I think me and Daniel were talking about is kind of like, actually I think in psychotherapy, a higher level of cognition where there's neurotic spiraling, where you're actually at least aware enough to start spiraling inside your own head versus just taking as a given the basically NPC model images of the society telling you that. But in both cases, the problem is that you're actually completely deafening yourself from surprise, because everything's already given to you. Everything's a given. So there's no information getting passed through there, that membrane, that's surprising or striking. And if it does show up, it's usually a threat. It's like so it's actually not even treated as a positive, optimistic thing. It's treated immediately as a threat because it's other, because it's not in the paradigm of the model, both either in your neurotic self-image head or in the NPC model. It's the regime's definitions for today that we operate with. Just on that note, with Javier is saying, by the way, that's interesting too, because I also tie it in a little, because trying to connect it with this idea of the different interference models. Right, there's discussions in active listening. There's different levels of it. The most basic level of it is just to repeat what's said to you, turn off your brain to take that self-narrative mode out, and just repeat back what's said to you, which is like basically parroting, right? It's actually not legitimate, because all you're doing is just repeating exactly what's said back to you. The higher level of that is power of kind of emotive summarization, where you grab at what's being said at its motivation, its context and intent, plus what's said in its content, and you put that all together into one summarizational statement that, when done correctly in this mode of presence, generates a "that's right" response from the other party. So it creates literally a resonant response from the other member, who gets this return back to them. Now, what happens after that? That tends to actually create that. I just want to point out that what Javi is kind of getting at about maybe a way to operate concretely this Buber-esque I-thou dynamic, how to get started with it. Maybe that's a way to talk about it, because idea is a difference between a dead repetition versus something that's of a resonant essence being reflected back to someone. In both cases, I've had that experience too. I try to give to other people, but as well as received it. There is sometimes that kind of resonant, emotive, essential statement given back to what's being said, I'm saying, that creates surprise. It's like, I didn't even realize that's what I understood. I didn't even realize it's actually the rearticulation happens. I think that quality of surprise is a really powerful model, because that is kind of describing essentially what's happening here. This is kind of new information, because if it was mutual information, it was exactly the same, nothing new showing up. It just passes to us as nothing. It's just noise in the background. Surprise is kind of striking through, that pierces through to give new information, basically. And kind of how we navigate and respond to it is a very telling point, because there's a very big difference that happens between that. Okay, that's all for me.
No, that's magnificent, Mr. Murphy. Good to see you, sir. It's a pleasure. No, it's almost like mastery can only be identified in light of the surprise. Mastery is not the ability to create a consistency. That almost seems to be it's almost like mastery of anything is only consistent, is about creating consistency to the degree that you can't have surprise without consistency. So consistency is the situation by which surprise can occur, that then the mastery can be identified in its response to that surprise. And it's interesting, because when I hear Buber talk about don't plan what you're going to say, it's like, don't defend yourself from the surprise. When I think about Lacan's The Real, that's when your desire is thwarted, the surprise. When I think about Leibniz, the reason we need a situation is so that you can be surprised, and that's where the reality comes out. When I think about the brain trying to save energy, your brain is trying to save like a consistency where most things are consistent. So then there's a vividness to the surprise. Like, so the surprise is possible. I was talking with Matthew Allison, and it was, we were talking about how, because it's almost like natural laws exist, so that then surprise is meaningful. If there was no consistency to nature, then when nature broke the consistency, it would not create any surprise. There'd be no intelligible surprise. So it's almost like everything in reality is toward consistency, regularity, a lack of energy, so that then there is the meaningful possibility of a surprise in relation to which our humanity can be identified or come out, ergo mastering. And then you would almost want to say that auto-mastery of that highest form is the ability to even almost thoughtlessly respond to surprise. And that's almost the height of beauty. Like the ability to, no matter what surprise is thrown at you, Mr. Luber, it's a pleasure, sir. Thank you for being here on our special snow edition. It's like no matter what is thrown at you, you are able to respond to it in that beautiful way, in a way of dance, not just, and it's almost like you couldn't have dance without surprise. Like that very possibility requires surprise. And then the value of consistency is the possibility of that surprise. But mostly we go through life thinking that, oh no, the point is to remove the unknowns, to remove surprise, to know what you're going to say, as opposed to training yourself to where you're able to respond no matter what is said, that you're ready for life no matter what is thrown at you. And so then everything is about creating that consistency, so that meaningfulness of surprise, and then the meaningfulness and the power of the response of the human can be there. But let me pass it to Michelle and then Mr. Ebert. Michelle, please.
Yeah, so this has all been really great. Thank you so much. I was thinking about just how truly difficult it is to do what Javier is talking about and what Buber's talking about, and it makes me think about like in the realm of it's kind of like what they call conscious parenting. But let me just, it's kind of like, I think that there's a lot of times a discussion on empathy and what it means to really hear somebody else. And I think we have to be aware that different contexts are going to afford certain things, and some contexts are not going to have certain abilities. Like for example, a space like this is very different than if we all had like 10 hours at our house or something, where I'm like, we're having meals, there's a silent time, there's ability to just sit one-on-one on a couch. Like there's all those types of like kind of spatial things that are sometimes, what's that, baby? Okay, that's for facilitating the hearing in certain ways. And I think that perhaps in an environment like this, in a way, it's like, is it, you know, it does start to call into question, like, is it wrong to think of an actual response to what somebody said? I don't think we should think about it so much in terms of right or wrong, but rather maybe like the fact that are we actually kind of responding to what other people are really saying? Like, are we really hearing what other people are saying? Or does it literally just go from somebody talking to, I'm talking now, you know? And that's where like that kind of not ability, that I think that's where we can start to feel more of that like kind of monologue exchange that is problematic. But yeah, I think about it with, you know, with the conscious parenting kind of concept of like actually just slowing down, you know, slowing down, sitting down and saying, like, I really like how you're saying that, Thomas, talking about like when you repeat back, like, okay, not just a empty rep, this is what I hear you saying. Is that right? Or do I have that wrong? I hear that this is something that you're saying, but I don't know if I'm quite understanding that. Like admitting that, kind of having humility be a part of that conversation, even I don't know if that's too explicit, but I do think that a lot of it maybe has, I'm just trying to brainstorm on how to actually infuse conversations generally with more of that presence, with more of that, not just like talking over somebody or like assuming the interpretation of what they said. So I think it takes the slowing down, so maybe some questions, genuine questions, admitting that I might not understand, but I'd like to, or I'm hearing, this is what I'm hearing. Am I hearing that correctly? Because sometimes we just hear what we want to hear. We don't hear what the other person's really saying. So, but that's also very different, like when you're talking about maybe something like that's an emotional thing you're going through, or if it's something where it's like, I mean, in the realm, a lot of it seems to be like the whole, in a way, the purpose seems to be that we can kind of have those ideas engage so that we respond directly in particular to certain, you can move that, baby, just particular things that have been said, but then also kind of share like what that brought up for us so that it's generative, because we wouldn't really anticipate it being like somebody says something and then like nobody says anything, like unless that's what we desire. But I'm not sure that's the context for that sort of thing. But then again, like there are some meditative online groups that like there's like they'll do this sort of like so anyways, yeah, I just think like thinking about context and spaces also can, I think, help us understand like what are the spaces that might afford certain things over, but also like being creative and challenging the existing spaces and being like, what are ways in which we can kind of infuse more of that hearing, actually hearing what the other person's saying, not just listening, but hearing in that understanding way, that being here sort of way. So anyways, I just wanted to say all that. Thank you.
I think you have exhibited your auto mastery of surprise very well as Reed beat up your earring with that and strum. So you were ready for a surprise. Very well done. And your earrings actually do sound like a perfect like little gong sound. So bam, right on it. Well done. And
his playing drums on my earrings is awesome.
Is all over it. And I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert here. And no, it's like all of these, like on that kind of idea of conscious slowing down, parent, it's almost like there's a way in which the creation of the membrane through philosophy so that feedback is possible, ergo dance versus absorb, just being absorbed, is in fact a kind of conscious relating, a kind of slow down, okay, this is what my thinking thinks is truth and good and thing, but let me slow down and think about this. okay, we're talking about this topic. Let me, like, is that what you mean? Or this is what I heard? Or how do we connect? There's some sort of way in which there's a, you know, Ivan Illich talks about dwelling principle. And there's like, how do we relate so that we dwell as opposed to just be absorbed? And, you know, using the language we're talking about, how do we relate so that we dance? Well, then we have to create a membrane, but we have to do that without creating a wall. And we have to do that without being alone. Okay, these are all very tricky things. And again, like we were saying at the philosophy of lack conversation, I've just been thinking a lot about Beatrice in Dante and how Beatrice is like, hey, Dante, if I smile too much too soon, you'll reduce to ash. And there's an art form that Beatrice is guiding Dante through Paradiso in. And it's almost like you need ethics to get through hell, and you need Beatrice to get through kind of Paradiso, which we could associate here with relationships, friendships. There's some sort of art form that is present there that Beatrice sort of shows that is not self-evident. It is not obvious how to engage in these negotiations, or how much to show versus not, how much of a membrane to draw or not. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert, and then if anyone has closing things, I will have to go here in a bit, but this has been a complete delight. So Mr. Ebert, please.
Hello. Something about the masters of art. I think on a cognitive science level, this could be interesting to explore, is that again, predictive mind theory, we've all basically been talking about it, but just to put it in predictive mind theory terms, we create through repetition and knowledge acquisition a basic schematic of our environment and our world, such that we don't have to think about our world and we can interact with it automatically. Otherwise, we'd expend too much energy. As I've been saying, we've all been sort of talking about that, and that surprise, or what they would call prediction errors. So like, wait a minute, that's not a cup. Is that a cup? I don't know what that is, actually. What is that? Prediction error, or newness, or surprise, is recognized by the artist not as awful. And I use awe in the sense that Jonathan Haidt and Keltner, whose first name I forget, maybe it's Jim or something, but they've done a bunch of experiments on awe. And essentially that awe, whether it's awful or awesome, is simply an encounter with a stimulus that overwhelms the preceding ontological, schema of the predictive mind. So of what you've already established, like that's a table, this is a thing. Wait, that's a thing that overwhelms these schematic, and therefore produces either awe in one way or the other. I need to assimilate it in some semblance, but it may produce a sense of terror, like it's an intercategorical monster, as Vervaeke would say. Like the monster is always a clown that is a horse or whatever, and it's like this intercategorical thing, and thereby it's a monster. A trans person is monstrous to the trad mind, etc. So the artist in some ways seems like they're able to see, or more readily see, that which is a prediction error as awesome. Even if it's ugly and overwhelming or terrible, there's something that's like, yeah. There's something that is inherently, therefore, I guess we interpret, I tend to interpret, or, I guess it's self-serving to interpret that as courageous. There's something about the artist that is a bit more courageous intellectually, and is willing to see things that are intercategorical monsters or errors or surprise as awesome, as opposed to awful. And something about the artist that hunts for surprise, or hunts for prediction errors, and is able to detect a prediction error, like, oh, that's different. This is different. This is different. Here we go. I'm going to take this difference and now put it into my art, or communicate this difference in a way that hopefully strikes other people as likewise awesome. Last thing I wanted to say is that easily, and this comes up in improv, but performance broadly, is that generally the most inspiring, awesome thing ever communicated during performance is when you sense that the performer does not care about the audience, right? But what you're actually experiencing is sort of like, that's why I was called it like a great performer, a permissionary. You're experiencing a sort of confrontation. I experience this on stage all the time. I let go of all of my status anxiety, which is really the only impedance to full expression, as a confrontation, which I know on subtle levels inspires others at a certain point to be like, oh, wait a minute. I guess if he's gonna move the goalpost that far, well, then I can at least move a couple inches closer, and suddenly there's this liberatory effect that cascades throughout the audience, and suddenly everyone's having a good time, right? So there is something about there's something about that, and then there's also something. There's something about that which seems to, it's interesting because it goes both ways in a perfectly Hegelian and philosophical conundrum, but as Javier, that really listening to someone may be like an active impedance, and I certainly experience that when I'm trying to listen to someone. Like, okay, let me just suppress basically my overactive mind and really listen to this person. Like, let me impede the babble. So either way, whether it's an impedance which creates a placidity or a saturation which creates a placidity, either way you have an ontological flooding or you have a flat line. Either way you have, the line may feel higher or lower, a flooded plain versus a flat valley, but it's topologically still flat. And the audience, whether the amazing performer is allowing them to oversaturate to a sort of mindlessness, or whatever the case is, and you know, you think about the froth of kids at a festival, and they want that feedback loop to create like a constructive interjection that essentially that distorts to the point of mindlessness, that sort of froth of ritualistic overload, which is tantamount to silence, which is, you know, within the throngs of awesomeness, just overwhelming that schema, the schematics of the mind. Anyway, I'm still just thinking through this, but there's something there, and I generally, my clothing statement is that let me get back from my nudity, just draw it back here, is that I find this particular conversation, which has come up a number of times here, in terms of like, what is the philosopher? What do they do? Do you feel the loneliness? Like, what's the phenomenology of the thinker, and how we relate to others, and the sort of inherent aloneness, and this solipsistic, but you know, and then returning to common life, and this thing which has long been a thing for you, Daniel. I think it's a really rich topic, and I think introducing the idea of feedback in general terms really cracks the conversation open. Especially when we feedback really relates to absolutely everything from waveforms to mirror neurons and so on. So anyway, yeah.
No, that's outstanding. And again, thank you for being here when you're feeling ill. That is no fun. So I hope you feel better. Our children were just sick for like 2 weeks, and it just kind of circles and circles. And you're like, when will it end? When will it end? It becomes very suboptimal, but not in a manner that creates dynamism. It creates everyone lying on the carpet, waiting and praying for it to go away. So thank you for that. It was interesting because, you know, one of the things too, like in your speaking on this interesting notion of planning to speak in a manner that is not hearing the other person. Like if I ask myself right now, is the following comment something that, because I thought of it while Ebert was speaking, I was not fully listening to him, or is the comment I'm about to say relating to him? Because you want to speak in a manner that speaks to what you just said, because otherwise there's just random following one another, right? It's actually monologue. The very effort to be present to avoid monologue actually guarantees monologue in a way, right? So it's an interesting thing where you're listening, but then when you say, oh, I'm thinking I'm going to say that, because that would really relate and meet what Ebert just said. So there's an interesting way too, where you're listening and thinking about what you're going to say, actually to relate to the person, which then is almost like if I'm present and I'm completely open to you, but then I can't say something that relates to you, who cares? Like I'm open to you, but it's almost like nothingness. It's like, yes, I'm completely open to what you have to say, but then I don't have anything to say, so who cares? It's like, it's interesting because there's a tension here between making sure what you have to say to the person establishes a relationship, which requires you to think about what you're going to say, which then runs the risk of impeding the relationship. Well, right there is the danger that the artist likes, right? We've been talking about the danger is like, yeah, I'm going to lean into that, you know, the breaking, the surprise. I'm going to lean into that tension, because that very fact that you have to make a decision on what you're going to say is a kind of tension. Because I'm thinking about what I'm going to say, I'm going to run the risk of speaking over Ebert, but also because I'm thinking about, but the whole reason I'm thinking about what I'm going to say is because I want to meet Ebert. Well, that's a really nervous tension. And the artist goes, yeah. And the philosopher goes, yeah, we're going to work with that. We're going to lean into that, as opposed to have a conversation of, say, small talk, where I never have to worry about that tension, because we all agree that we're going to talk about the weather. So there's no risk of not meeting the other person or impeding upon anything, because we're all absorbed into the script. So it's interesting how that tension in of itself in conversation kind of speaks into something the artist leans into. And I'm also now thinking about what, differences between feedback, as in what feeds you back, food creates energy, and what creates energy is what ruins consistency, because consistency saves energy. So we need to say something back to one another that keeps us from falling into conserving energy. But then if you do that too much, the other person is overwhelmed in a bad way, right? So how do we speak in a manner that is feeding energy back to one another to keep us in a surprise state, but not so much that we're overwhelmed and we're not able to comprehend? That seems to be what good feedback does. We're able to feed surprise back to one another, but to a degree where it can energize, be a feeding of energy, not to the point where it overwhelms in a negative way. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin here if you'd like to speak. I'm now thinking it's almost like there's a difference between overwhelm, which I associate with a kind of Lovecraftian sort of reduced to ash, kind of like overwhelmed. There's almost like washed over, maybe I want to say withwhelmed or upwhelmed, like a conversation like Beatrice is like upwhelming you. Like it's not like because we mentioned improv. And like when I think about when we did the jazz improvs at Eunoia, where I was on the piano, it feels like being overwhelmed because, oh, the music's really going, but it's almost like upwhelmed. Like this kind of like, oh, we're all going up together and we have the mastery to go up together. It's not overwhelmed in the, Michael Coleman is freaking good at the guitar. I'm overwhelmed and like Lovecraftian reduced. It's almost like an improv, which almost does somehow seem to be the highest form in that. I don't want to say that, well, it's always a debate, right? But there's something about, let's say it this way, the improv condition seems to be the auto mastery that allows the possibility of the upwhelm. And it's like the upwhelm is what we seek, that requires the surprise. That is like the shared response to a surprise that makes possible this kind of upwhelm. Mr. Jockin, please. I saw you unmoved, but no pressure at all.
I know we have to go. Just what I'm overhearing with these comments, I'm hearing overlaps with lack.
Yeah.
Where lack is introduced in these dynamics, it's an operation of something more is abounding in front of us that is retroactively changing everything that came prior in the mental model, but then pointing to something, this addition that's happening at the same time. Idea of a kind of an error, some kind of surprise, some newness showing up. That's so when I say lack, I'm pointing towards those phenomena or relationships, and especially that what was brought about the idea of like when a person does come, they kind of give that freedom, right? They're in that act of freedom that gives permission, and the audience's NPC kind of response to it to be more free themselves, right? So the relationship of freedom and lack, which we've discussed in other conversations, I'm sensing some overlap with that. And by the way, the idea you're talking about, this kind of overwhelm, right, of a kind of generative abounding. I think the word I'm thinking is redounding. So when things redound, there's a kind of definite excess that generates more out of it via emanation of light, for example, or basically the emanation of being, basically onto particular beings, for example. So when I'm hearing your story about improv performances that have this kind of flow state quality of demand, and that's the whole point. You have enough skill and mastery so that you can answer to the call of the demand of the improvising. And if you weren't skilled enough, you eventually fall off, and that's what happens usually. But when you're in that flow state of challenge and then seizing opportunity and kind of playing off it, that's that kind of redounding that's going on in the performance. And that's, by the way, not just in you, Daniel. That redounding is coming from this third thing called the relationship of the performance, because it's other people you're playing with that you have to resonate and respond with to create this effect. It's not just in yourself in that particular point. All right, that's all for me.
No, that's lovely. And now I'm thinking, like, it's almost like you have, because what's the difference? I've just been thinking a lot, the difference between Lovecraft and Dante. So Lovecraft, you see the creature, you're overwhelmed, reduced to ash. Beatrice is like, hey, follow me. I have the skill to guide you. Oh, one false step and suddenly heaven turns into Lovecraft. That's what Beatrice is saying. He's like, one false step, Dante, and all of heaven turns into Lovecraft just like that. And so there's this kind of skill there. And then there's something about, like, we're talking about this negative womb, like return to the womb where everything is stable. So it's almost like in the jazz improv, it's very much like a womb state, but maybe it's like a birthing, like the womb is birthing versus stable in a kind of comfortable, but it's also stable in the Up-Whelm, in the birthing. I'm thinking a bunch of metaphors together because there's something about the jazz, because we were talking at the Philosophy of Lack just the other day, and Mr. Ebert is exactly right, that there's something about a kind of womb state, a kind of at a climax, the time squirrel, which I'm going to get a tattoo. There's something about that is very much like a womb state, and we were talking about the fertilization, and it's interesting because it's like there's Lovecraftian overwhelm, where you don't have the skill or the cultivation, or you haven't made enough membrane to not be absorbed in or like flattened by. So if I'm using that language, overwhelm, then there's a kind of stable state that is the non-playable character or sort of desire to return to a womb that's not challenging. But then there's also this kind of Up-Whelm that is this, just to make up a term, a redundancy, that is very much like the equilibrium of a womb space, and yet there's a birth, there's an upness to it, there's an Up-Whelm to it, there's a life to it, there's a fulfillment in the auto-mastery that emerges from having the skill to be able to participate in a jazz improv as if there is no membrane, because you're all flowing with one another. The membrane moves to the jazz improv as a whole. That's what's kind of interesting. It's like the membrane becomes everyone in this Up-Whelm experience versus a division that is individuating in a problematic way. But this is also, weirdly enough, very similar to the problematic absorbing we talked about before, like the absorbing of ideology, like the flow state of the jazz improv is in a very real sense isomorphic to the absorbing in an ideology, and yet there's a difference. And it has something to do with this kind of feedback that everyone has, where they're feeding one another a surprise. You don't know what the pianist is going to do. You don't know what the drummer is going to do. And yet you do. And so there's this weird mixture of the surprise state with enough auto mastery to treat the surprise as if it's not a surprise. That seems to be the magic kind of transmutative moment where you get to the point where you can treat a surprise that is what is technically a surprise as if it is not a surprise. And that seems to be a kind of beauty here, some kind of Up-Whelm. But what's so fascinating is how formally they're all very similar. The difference seems to be the feedback, the character of the feedback that's going on, where maybe we could say the feedback of the absorbed state of ideology is there's no surprise. It's a uniformity of a lack of surprise. Whereas in the jazz state, there's a uniformity of the ability to respond to the surprise in a term of auto mastery. So which then creates the membrane outside the group versus in the group. And yet there actually is membranes in the group because the pianist is not the same as the guitarist or the drummer or things like that. So it's very interesting to think of this kind of womb state problematic, overwhelm, up-whelm, redundancy. I will have to think on those things. So I appreciate those comments. Anything else from anyone before we run? I've enjoyed this immensely.
Hope your hair stays on.
Yes. We never know in Virginia.
I was gonna say feel better, Ebert, but he's gone. Bye.
Yeah. Well, actually, he actually
Thomas,
just went unconscious. He's like, goodbye. He's like, Rosebud. And then he dropped. Thank you, Mr. Jock, and it's a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks,
sir.
Thomas. Bye.
All the best.